Dr. Rachel Carson, with her poetic pen and scientific mind, was one that could not be replicated or forgotten for her efforts towards environmental consciousness. She wrote the book that launched the environmental movement and leaving a legacy through the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and ban of the pesticide DDT. Rachel Carson grew up in the small, rural town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. Her mother encouraged her to pursue literature that would later become a large factor in her career as an environmentalist. As Rachel Carson grew up, she was an outstanding student who excelled in all her classes and finished high school with top marks. Carson went on to college and attended the Pennsylvania College for Women with an English major. With a new interest, Carson attended Johns Hopkins University with a major in biology. This change was a very bold move by Carson because few women entered into the field of science. Carson began her first job at the U.S. Bureau of Fish and Wildlife Services, writing public brochures about fish populations. Much of her work revolved around research. However, she was thrust into the public eye and her life and career were turned around after the publishing of her book, Silent Spring, which was a bestseller and the driving force for the banning of the pesticide DDT. Dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, or more commonly called DDT, was an insect control pesticide. DDT was used to kill bugs that transmitted diseases or harmed crops. It was widely used in World War II to control different diseases, including malaria, typhus, body lice, and bubonic plague. DDT was reasonably inexpensive and was very effective. DDT was highly used by farmers across the country to protect their crops.
That's about the time in the early 50s that it really became a part of agriculture, especially here in California, which I'm familiar with. And the big product at that time was DDT and sulfur dust, because sulfur would suppress many of the insects, such as the mite, that would defoliate the cotton. The sulfur would affect them, and the DDT would take care of the lygus and the bollworm. And so it became a very popular product. And about that time, the airplane became a part of agriculture here in California, and they changed the product from basically a dust to a liquid.
Before its ban, 1.35 billion pounds of DDT was used in the U.S. itself. Approximately 80% of DDT was used on cotton, with the remainder mostly on peanuts, soybeans, and other uses. One of Carson's encounters with the devastating effects of DDT was when an Alabama woman, Olga Huckins, wrote her, "The mosquito control plane flew over our small town last summer. The harmless shower bath killed 7 of our lovely birds. All these birds died horribly in the same way. Their bills were gaping open, and their splayed claws were drawn up to their breasts in agony." Carson wrote back telling her that it was the letter that had started it all, and that had led her to realize that I must write the book. On September 27th of 1962, Carson published her controversial book about DDT called Silent Spring. During Carson's research of DDT, she discovered that the use of pesticides in the environment would slowly build up in untargeted populations and create a variety of birth defects and problems with the reproductive systems of the species.
We have to remember that children born today are exposed to these chemicals from birth, perhaps even before birth. Now, what is going to happen to them in adult life as a result of that exposure? We simply don't know.
After the publishing of Silent Spring, chemical companies were enraged with Carson. She took on remarks that demoted her book and ideas.
A spokesman for the chemical industry, Dr. Robert White Stevens.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field.
When the Silent Spring came out by Rachel Carson, the mood in the chemical industry was went defensive to start with, and then kind of became offensive because a lot of her claims were not true. A lot of her claims were accusations made out of hysteria and emotion, and a lot of the chemical people pointed that out for the simple reason she was on a trip to ban all chemicals. And she said, you know, these agricultural chemical manufacturers are just in it for the money. Well, these agricultural chemical manufacturers were the pharmaceutical companies that make aspirin, Bayer, one of the biggest ones, Monsanto, Geigy, American Chemical Association, American AmChem they called them. They were all chemical companies that made medicines.
While DDT usage was at a rapid decline from numerous factors, including increased insect resistance, growing public concern over negative environmental side effects, and increased government restrictions on the pesticide, Silent Spring was the impetus for Congress to ban DDT. On June 4, 1963, Rachel Carson made an appearance before Congress, providing testimony to the Subcommittee of Reorganization. She showed countless examples and evidence of DDT's harmful effects on the environment to sway Congress to ban DDT. Carson stated, "The contamination of the environment with harmful substances is one of the major problems of modern life. The world of air and water and soil supports not only the hundreds of thousands of species of animals and plants, it supports man himself." It was not until several years later that Carson's efforts were rewarded. Although Carson had passed away years before in 1964, her book, Silent Spring, and the environmental movement that came from it led to the federal government under President Nixon to form the Environmental Protection Agency with a mission to protect human health and the environment.
People in the environmental movement all wanted more attention paid to the environment. And one way the president wanted to respond to that was by creating a new agency that put under one umbrella several existing agencies and gave them the responsibility for cleaning up the air and the water and all the other problems associated with the environment.
In 1972, the first Environmental Protection Agency administrator, William D. Ruckelshaus, banned DDT in the United States.
An extensive hearing was held with a hearing officer who was an employee of EPA. He recommended that it not be banned, that it continue to be used. It was then appealed to the administrator of EPA, which job I held at the time. And after reading the transcript and listening to 2 days of arguments from the opponents and proponents of DDT, I decided it should be limited greatly in its use, essentially banned.
Carson has left a dynamic legacy to sustain the environment we live in. There is no question, a government expert on natural resources said following her death, that Silent Spring prompted the federal government to take action against water and air pollution, as well as against the misuse of pesticides, several years before otherwise might have moved.
She can demonstrate how to lead by the passion of her prose, by the fact that she believed quite deeply in what she was saying and wrote about it in terms that were very appealing to people. She had an enormous effect on the country and on our paying attention to the environment, not by leading in the sense of leading a big organization, but leading by the written word, which was very persuasive to people.
Carson was a leader not because of who she was, but in spite of it. A woman, a scientist, a writer, a person with conviction. She did not presume to be in the front of the room, but through her words and works, Carson motivated people to become engaged in her cause, the respect of and caring for the natural environment. She made people think differently about their place in the environment, not ruling it, but merely being part of it. She succeeded in leading everyday people and those in power down a new path of environmental protection. That was her greatest legacy.